At 1447, on August 18, 1944, Lieutenant Royce Priest watched his squadron commander's P-51 Mustang erupt in flames over occupied France. Black smoke poured from the engine as the crippled fighter dropped toward a wheat field 20 miles behind German lines. Priest was 21 years old with just 2 months of combat experience, and the man he idolized was about to become a prisoner of war. Or worse. The ambush had been perfect. German forces had hidden an anti-aircraft battery inside what looked like an ordinary railway car marked with Red Cross symbols. When Major Bert Marshall led his 4-ship flight in for a strafing run near Saint-Étienne, the sides of the boxcar dropped away to reveal 20mm and 40mm guns already tracking their approach. The trap sprung at point-blank range. Marshall's Mustang took the worst of it. One shell punched through below the exhaust stack. Another tore into the radiator scoop. Coolant hemorrhaged into the slipstream as the aircraft pulled away, trailing fire and smoke. The fighter had minutes of flight time remaining, maybe less. Priest watched the burning Mustang disappear below the tree line. Every regulation, every procedure, every survival instinct told him what came next. Note the location, radio the coordinates to search and rescue, return to base, let the rescue teams do their job, let Marshall take his chances with capture. But Priest's hand stopped on the radio switch. He had already made his choice. What happened next would become the first successful piggyback rescue in a P-51 Mustang in the history of the 8th Air Force. It would save one man's life, earn another the nation's second highest award for valor, and create a dilemma that would reach all the way to General James Doolittle himself. This is the story of 2 men, 1 aircraft, and an impossible decision made at 400 miles per hour over enemy territory. The War over France. By August 1944, the air war over France had become a deadly game of hide and seek. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. General George Patton's Third Army was racing across the French countryside. The Luftwaffe was in retreat, its fighter arm crippled by months of attrition over Germany. But German anti-aircraft defenses had become masters of concealment and ambush. The statistics tell a brutal story. Between June and August 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 341 heavy bombers to flak alone, with another 10,972 damaged. Flak batteries accounted for 2/3 of all bomber losses during these months. For fighters flying low-altitude strafing missions, the danger was even more acute. The 355th Fighter Group alone had lost 17 pilots in the 2 months before Marshall went down. Some were killed instantly by direct hits. Others belly-landed in enemy territory and spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft prison camps. A few simply vanished, their fates never confirmed. The Germans had turned concealment into an art form. They disguised gun positions as haystacks in farm buildings. They hid batteries in church steeples and wine cellars. They mounted guns on railway flat cars and moved them between firing positions. And now they were using boxcars marked with Red Cross symbols, a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions, but devastatingly effective against pilots who had been trained not to fire on medical transports. American fighter pilots faced impossible choices on every mission. Fly high and you present an easier target for the heavy flak guns. Fly low to avoid the 88mm weapons and you expose yourself to the lighter but more numerous 20mm and 37mm guns. Attack ground targets and you fly straight into concentrated fire from positions you can't see until it's too late. The P-51 Mustang was designed for high-altitude bomber escort, not low-level ground attack. Its liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable to even minor damage. A single well-placed round could drain the coolant system in minutes, leaving a pilot with the choice between a dead-stick landing in enemy territory or bailing out. The odds were simple. Every pilot in the 355th Fighter Group knew them. When you went down behind enemy lines, you had 3 possible outcomes. If you were very lucky, you could evade capture and make it back to Allied lines on foot with help from the French resistance. If you were less lucky, you'd spend the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. If you were unlucky, you'd never make it out of your aircraft alive. In this environment of constant danger and mounting losses, the bonds between pilots became more than just camaraderie. They became lifelines. You flew with men you trusted. You covered their tails in dogfights. You escorted them home when they were damaged. And when they went down, you were supposed to note the location, call it in, and keep flying. That was the procedure. That was the regulation. That was how you survived to fight another day. But regulations don't account for everything. They don't account for the moment when you watch your hero's aircraft catch fire and fall toward enemy territory. They don't account for the split-second decision between following orders and following your conscience. And they certainly don't account for what happens when a 21-year-old lieutenant decides that some men are too important to lose. 2 pilots, 2 stories. Burt Wilder, Marshall Jr. was already a legend before he ever climbed into a P-51 Mustang. Born in Royce City, Texas, on November 9, 1918, Marshall had been a 3-time All-State quarterback in Texas high school football, the only player in state history to achieve that distinction. At Vanderbilt University, he earned honorable mention All-American honors as a tailback. Football fans across Texas and Tennessee knew his name. He was fast, smart, and fearless, with a natural gift for reading the field and making split-second decisions under pressure. When the war came, Marshall joined the Army Air Corps. He arrived at the 355th Fighter Group's 354th Fighter Squadron in early June 1944 with only 3 hours of flight time in the P-51 after transitioning from the P-40 Warhawk. 3 hours. Most pilots spent weeks familiarizing themselves with a new aircraft before seeing combat. Marshall flew his second combat mission on D-Day itself. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Marshall shot down a German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber over the invasion fleet. 2 weeks later, he destroyed 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters in a single engagement, saving the lives of pilots in his squadron. By early August, he had 5 confirmed aerial victories, making him an ace in the shortest time in the history of the 355th Fighter Group. His aggressive flying style and tactical brilliance earned him rapid promotions that would have been impossible in peacetime. He went from pilot to flight leader in days, from flight leader to operations officer in 2 weeks, from operations officer to squadron commander in under 2 months. But Marshall was more than just an ace pilot and rising star. He was the kind of officer who led from the front. He could have delegated the dangerous strafing missions to his subordinates. As squadron commander, he had every right to fly the safer escort missions at altitude. Instead, he flew the missions he was asking his men to fly. He took the risks he was asking them to take, and his men loved him for it. Royce Priest had known of Burt Marshall long before they ever met. Growing up, Priest had followed Marshall's football career in the newspapers. When he discovered they were assigned to the same squadron, he considered it the luckiest break of his military career. Here was his chance to learn from a genuine hero, someone who excelled at everything he attempted. Priest studied Marshall's tactics. He watched how Marshall positioned his aircraft in formation. He observed how Marshall approached combat, how he communicated with his wingmen, how he made decisions under fire. Marshall became more than just Priest's commanding officer. He became his mentor, his model for what a fighter pilot should be. Born on April 9, 1923, in Parsons, Kansas, Priest had joined the Army Air Corps at 17 after lying about his age. He wanted to fly more than anything in the world, but the Air Corps wasn't accepting pilots without college education, and Priest couldn't afford college. He enlisted as a regular soldier and worked his way up, determined to prove himself worthy of flight training. When he finally earned his wings, it felt like vindication. When he was assigned to the same squadron as Burt Marshall, it felt like destiny. By August 1944, Priest had logged 2 months of combat operations. He was still green by fighter pilot standards, still learning the 1,000 small lessons that separated survivors from casualties. But he had learned one thing absolutely. Burt Marshall was the kind of leader worth following, the kind of pilot worth protecting, the kind of man worth saving. That belief was about to be tested in the most extreme way imaginable. The mission. The morning briefing at RAF Steeple Morden on August 18, 1944, outlined what should have been a routine mission. The 354th Fighter Squadron would fly a ground attack sortie against German railway targets in occupied France. Rail yards were high-value targets. They moved supplies and reinforcements to German forces fighting the Allied advance. Disrupting rail transport meant slowing the German ability to reinforce threatened positions. Marshall designated himself to lead a 4-ship flight. Priest would fly as his wingman. 2 other P-51s would complete the formation. The mission profile called for low-altitude attack runs, using the Mustang 650 caliber machine guns to strafe locomotives, rail cars, and infrastructure. It was dangerous work, but it was the work that needed doing. The 4 Mustangs took off from Steeple Morden and crossed the English Channel. They flew low over the French countryside, navigation aided by landmarks that had become familiar over weeks of operations. The landscape below told the story of war and liberation. In the west, Allied forces controlled the territory. In the east, German forces still held ground, though they were falling back under constant pressure. The flight approached their primary target area. Marshall led them toward what appeared to be a concentration of rail traffic. Standard operating procedure called for the flight leader to scout the target before committing the entire formation. Marshall could have dispatched one of his subordinates for the reconnaissance pass. Instead, he designated himself and told the others to orbit out of range while he checked the flak defenses. It was a decision that saved 3 lives and nearly cost his own. As Marshall's Mustang dropped toward the railway yard for a closer look, Priest maintained position in the covering flight. They watched Marshall make his approach. The railway cars looked like any others, freight carriers, flat cars, the standard rolling stock of occupied France. Some bore Red Cross markings, indicating medical supplies or wounded personnel. American pilots had strict orders not to fire on Red Cross transports. Then, the sides of one of the boxcars dropped away. The ambush was perfect. German gunners had been waiting, guns already traversed and elevated, tracking the approaching fighter. 20mm cannons opened fire first, their shells reaching out across the distance in streams of tracers. 40mm guns followed, their heavier rounds exploding in lethal black bursts. Marshall's Mustang flew directly into the concentrated fire. At low altitude and close range, there was no time to evade, no room to maneuver. The aircraft took multiple hits almost simultaneously. One shell struck below the exhaust stack, smashing through engine components. Another round tore into the radiator scoop, ripping open the cooling system. A third appeared to punch through the fuselage just behind the cockpit, narrowly missing the internal fuel tank that would have turned the aircraft into a fireball. Black smoke began pouring from the engine almost immediately. Orange flames licked back along the cowling. The P-51's Packard Merlin engine, normally a marvel of power and reliability, was dying. Coolant streamed from the damaged radiator, precious fluid hemorrhaging into the slipstream. Without coolant, the engine would overheat in minutes. Without power, the aircraft would become a glider. And gliders don't stay airborne for long. Marshall pulled up and away from the ambush, nursing the throttle, trying to keep the engine running as long as possible. His radio crackled with status reports. The other pilots in the covering flight had seen the hits. They knew what those smoke trails meant. Marshall's Mustang was finished. The only question was whether he could make it far enough from the guns to crash land in a relatively clear area. Priest watched from above as Marshall's aircraft descended toward a wheat field several miles from the ambush site. The smoke trail marked his path through the sky like a funeral pyre, and Priest made his decision. He was going down after him. The decision marshal's voice came over the radio, ordering Priest not to land. It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a request, it was a direct order from a superior officer in combat. Abort the rescue attempt, return to base. Those were the procedures, those were the regulations, and Marshall, even as his aircraft was dying beneath him, still commanded his squadron. Priest's hand moved to the radio switch. He could acknowledge the order. He could turn his Mustang west toward England and safety. He could follow the rules that every pilot in the 8th Air Force was expected to follow. When a man goes down behind enemy lines, you mark the position and call for search and rescue. You don't risk a second aircraft and a second pilot trying to effect an impossible pickup from enemy territory. The P-51 Mustang was a single-seat fighter. The cockpit measured 38 inches wide and 42 inches from the seat to the canopy rail. It was designed for one pilot wearing a parachute, a survival vest, and a seat-pack emergency dinghy. There was no room for passengers. There was no protocol for this kind of rescue. There wasn't even precedent for it in the entire history of the 8th Air Force. But Priest had already made his choice. He pushed the control stick forward and began his descent toward the same wheat field where Marshall's smoking aircraft had disappeared. The two other pilots in his flight circled overhead, providing top cover and watching for German response. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Priest was actually going to attempt a landing in occupied France to pick up his squadron commander. Marshall's aircraft had already touched down when Priest lined up his approach. The wheat field stretched roughly 800 yards in the direction of the wind. It would have to be enough. Priest dropped his flaps to 40 degrees, cut his airspeed to 90 miles per hour, and focused on the golden expanse of grain below him. Landing a P-51 Mustang in a cultivated field went against everything in the pilot's manual. The aircraft's liquid-cooled engine sat low in the fuselage, with the radiator scoop extending beneath the belly. Any obstruction taller than 18 inches could rupture the cooling system and destroy the engine. The retractable landing gear was built for paved runways, not soft French farmland. A single hidden rut or rock could collapse a landing strut and flip the aircraft onto its back. Priest ignored all of this. He had one focus: getting his Mustang on the ground in one piece so he could get Marshall out of enemy territory. The Mustang's nose blocked his forward view during the descent. He judged his approach by looking out the side of the canopy, estimating his height above the grain by the blur of wheat stalks rushing past his wingtip. The wheels touched down hard. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled into the soft earth. Wheat stalks whipped against the fuselage as Priest stood on the brakes. The Mustang slowed, shuddered, and finally stopped about 300 yards from the tree line where Marshall's burning aircraft had come to rest. Priest immediately swung the fighter around to face the direction he had come. If he needed to take off in a hurry, he couldn't afford to waste time turning around. The wheat field stretched 800 yards, with a heavy load that might barely be enough runway. Above him, the two remaining Mustangs from his flight scanned the roads and hedgerows. The German response came within seconds. A military truck appeared on a dirt road half a mile to the east, moving fast toward the wheat field. The canvas cover over the truck bed meant infantry. Priest estimated 20 to 30 soldiers based on the vehicle's size. The covering Mustangs rolled into their attack runs without hesitation. Each P-51 carried 650 caliber machine guns that could fire 1,400 rounds per second. The lead pilot opened fire at 400 yards, walking his tracers across the road and into the truck's engine compartment. The vehicle swerved, caught fire, and rolled into a ditch. But the truck was only the first response. A second vehicle was approaching from the north. A motorcycle with sidecar had appeared on a farm track to the south. German patrols were converging on the crash site from multiple directions. The clock was running. Two men, one cockpit priest, stood in his cockpit and searched the tree line for Marshall. Smoke rose from the woods where the squadron commander had gone down. Every pilot carried thermite grenades specifically to incinerate crashed fighters and prevent their technology from falling into enemy hands. The Mustang's Merlin engine, its K-14 gun sight, its IFF transponder, all of it had to burn. Marshall would have set the charges and gotten clear. 2 minutes passed. The covering Mustangs made another strafing run on the approaching motorcycle, scattering its riders into a hedgerow. Priest calculated his remaining time. The soft ground had left deep ruts behind his wheels. Taking off would require full power and every inch of the field. Adding a second man's weight to a single-seat cockpit would raise his stall speed and extend his takeoff roll. The mathematics were brutal. He might not have enough runway. 3 minutes. Still no sign of Marshall. The second truck had stopped a quarter-mile away. Priest could see soldiers dismounting, spreading into a skirmish line, beginning to advance through the wheat on foot. Their field-gray uniforms were visible above the golden stalks. Then, a figure emerged from the tree line. Major Burt Marshall was running toward the Mustang. His flight suit was blackened with soot. His face was twisted not with relief but with anger. He was waving his arms, not in greeting, but in fury. Even as he ran toward rescue, Marshall was ordering Priest to leave without him. Priest did the only thing he could think of. He climbed out of the cockpit, unbuckled his parachute harness, and dropped it onto the wing. Then, he removed his survival dinghy and tossed it into the wheat. The message was unmistakable. Without a parachute, Priest could not bail out if the engine failed on the flight home. Without the dinghy, he would drown if they went down over the English Channel. He was not leaving France without his commanding officer. Marshall stopped running. He stood 50 yards from the aircraft, staring at the discarded equipment on the wing. The German soldiers were now clearly visible above the wheat, their helmets bobbing as they pushed through the stalks. The covering Mustangs had exhausted most of their ammunition on the trucks. They could make one more strafing pass, maybe two, before their guns ran dry. Marshall sprinted the final distance to the aircraft. He understood the situation. Either they both got out or they both became prisoners. There was no time left for argument. The cockpit of a P-51D Mustang was designed for one pilot, just one. The space measured 38 inches wide and 42 inches from the seat to the canopy rail. Marshall was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed approximately 170 pounds. Priest was slightly smaller, but still filled the standard flight gear dimensions. Together, they would occupy a space meant for a single human being. Marshall climbed onto the wing first. He lowered himself into the cockpit and slid as far down as possible, his back pressed against the armored seat plate, his legs extended beneath the instrument panel alongside the control stick. Priest climbed in after him, settling onto Marshall's lap with his own legs straddling his commander's thighs. Their bodies compressed together like cargo in a shipping crate. The control stick jutted up between Priest's knees. His shoulders pressed against Marshall's chest, their heads nearly touched the canopy glass. Priest reached up and pulled the canopy closed. It latched with less than an inch of clearance above his flight helmet. The two men could barely breathe in the confined space. The August heat inside the greenhouse canopy was suffocating. Sweat immediately began soaking through their flight suits. The instrument panel was partially blocked by Priest's knees, but he could see the essential gauges: fuel pressure, oil temperature, manifold pressure. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the Merlin engine surge to full power. 1,200 horsepower roared through the airframe. The propeller clawed at the air, pulling the overloaded Mustang forward through the wheat. The aircraft accelerated slowly, too slowly. The combined weight of two pilots, full ammunition, and remaining fuel pushed the Mustang far beyond its designed gross weight. The soft ground dragged at the wheels. Wheat stalks battered the radiator scoop beneath the fuselage. Priest watched his airspeed climb, 60 miles per hour, 70, 80. The tree line at the end of the field rushed toward them. A P-51 Mustang normally lifted off at approximately 100 miles per hour. With the additional weight, Priest estimated he would need at least 115. His airspeed indicator showed 95 miles per hour as the trees filled his windscreen. He pulled back on the stick and felt the wheels leave the ground. The aircraft staggered into the air, barely climbing. The stall warning horn screamed in his ears. The treetops passed beneath them by what felt like inches. Branches scraped against the belly of the aircraft. Then they were clear, climbing slowly over the French countryside. Two men crammed into a single-seat fighter, alive against every reasonable expectation. The flight home. Behind them, German soldiers emerged from the wheat field and watched the Mustang disappear to the west. Their quarry had escaped. But Priest and Marshall were still 200 miles from England. The aircraft was dangerously overweight. The engine was overheating from the strain. And somewhere ahead, German fighters might still be hunting for stragglers. The two remaining Mustangs from the flight formed up on either side of Priest's aircraft as they climbed to 8,000 feet. Their role had shifted from combat escort to protective guardian. With their ammunition nearly depleted, they couldn't engage enemy fighters. But they could watch for threats and guide the overloaded aircraft home. Priest leveled off and reduced power to cruise settings. The engine temperature gauge had been climbing steadily since takeoff. He needed to cool the Merlin before it seized. The radiator scoop beneath the fuselage had ingested wheat stalks and debris during the ground roll. Airflow through the cooling system was partially blocked. The needle crept toward the red line with every passing minute. The flight path to England crossed 180 miles of occupied France before reaching the Channel coast. German flak batteries dotted the route. Luftwaffe airfields at Évreux-Fauville and Beauvais-Tillay could scramble interceptors within minutes if spotters reported American aircraft. Priest kept his altitude low enough to avoid radar detection, but high enough to glide to a landing if the engine failed. Inside the cockpit, the heat was becoming unbearable. The canopy acted like a greenhouse, trapping the August sun. Both men were drenched in sweat. Marshall's position beneath Priest meant he absorbed the full weight of his rescuer pressing down on his legs. Circulation was cut off within minutes. His feet went numb first, then his calves, then his thighs. He could not shift position even an inch. The confined space locked them both in place. Priest focused on flying. The control stick moved between his knees with limited range of motion. His elbows were pinned against his ribs by the narrow cockpit walls. Every input required careful precision. A sudden movement could jam the stick against Marshall's legs and send the aircraft into a roll. The escort pilots watched the engine cowling of Priest's Mustang with growing concern. Coolant was beginning to stream from the radiator, leaving a white trail in the slipstream. The Merlin engine was slowly cooking itself. They estimated 15 to 20 minutes before catastrophic failure if the temperature continued rising. Priest spotted the problem on his gauges. He had two options. He could reduce power further and extend his flight time, but risk not reaching the channel before nightfall. Or he could maintain speed and hope the engine held together long enough to reach friendly territory. He chose speed. Better to crash in the channel where rescue boats patrolled than to go down over occupied France where German patrols would be waiting. The French coastline appeared after 47 minutes of flight. The white cliffs of the Cotentin Peninsula passed beneath them, still held by Allied forces following the Normandy breakout. Priest allowed himself a moment of relief. They had cleared occupied territory. If the engine quit now, they would land among friends. The channel stretched ahead. 21 miles of cold gray water between France and England. Priest had discarded his dinghy in the wheat field. Marshall had abandoned his with the burning aircraft. If they went down in the water, neither man would survive more than a few minutes in the frigid current. The engine temperature gauge touched the red line as they crossed the halfway point. Priest watched the needle quiver at the upper limit, waiting for the sudden silence that would mean the Merlin had finally surrendered. The coastline of England appeared through the haze. White cliffs, green fields, the distinctive outline of the Isle of Wight to the east. The Mustang crossed the English coast with its engine still running. Priest began his descent toward RAF Steeple Morden, the 355th Fighter Group's home base in Cambridgeshire. The runway was still 60 miles ahead. The engine temperature was still climbing. He had saved his commander from the Germans. Now he had to save them both from the aircraft. Landing at Steeple Morden. The Mustang's engine began misfiring 12 miles from Steeple Morden. The steady roar of the Merlin fractured into an irregular stutter as overheated cylinders started failing. Priest enriched the fuel mixture and prayed the engine would hold together for another 5 minutes. The airfield appeared through the summer haze. 2 concrete runways formed an X pattern across the Cambridgeshire farmland. Fire trucks and ambulances were already positioning along the main strip. The tower had received radio reports from the escort pilots. Everyone at Steeple Morden knew that an impossible aircraft was inbound. Priest entered the landing pattern at 140 miles per hour, far faster than normal. The overweight Mustang needed the extra speed to maintain lift. He dropped his landing gear and felt the reassuring thunk of the wheels locking into place. Flaps came down in stages to 40 degrees. The aircraft ballooned slightly, then settled. The runway rushed up to meet them. Priest flared the aircraft and felt the main wheels touch concrete. The tail dropped. The Mustang rolled down the center line, decelerating smoothly. The engine was coughing and sputtering, but still turning. He applied the brakes and brought the aircraft to a stop halfway down the runway. Ground crews sprinted toward the Mustang before the propeller stopped spinning. They expected to find a wounded pilot, perhaps a dying man who had somehow nursed his crippled aircraft home. What they found was something no one had ever seen before. 2 pilots unfolded themselves from a single cockpit, like circus performers emerging from an impossibly small box. Marshall could not walk. His legs had been compressed beneath Priest's weight for nearly 2 hours. The circulation had been cut off so completely that he collapsed when he tried to stand on the wing. Ground crew members carried him to a waiting ambulance. Priest climbed down under his own power. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His legs were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. But he was alive. Marshall was alive. Against every regulation, against every reasonable expectation, they had both made it home. The news spread through the 355th Fighter Group within minutes. Pilots gathered around the aircraft to examine the evidence. Wheat stalks protruded from every opening in the airframe. The radiator scoop was packed with vegetation and debris. Oil streaked the cowling where the overheated engine had begun leaking. The ground crew chief estimated that the Merlin had been within seconds of seizing when Priest shut it down. Mechanics spent 2 days cleaning the aircraft. They extracted wheat stubble from the landing gear wells, the tailwheel housing, the radiator fins, and the gun ports. The radiator itself required complete disassembly to remove the packed debris. Several coolant lines had to be replaced. The engine needed a full inspection and partial rebuild. The rescue was unprecedented in the history of the 8th Air Force. Other pilots had attempted similar landings to retrieve downed comrades. Most had ended in disaster. Aircraft had flipped on soft ground, crashed into obstacles, or been destroyed by enemy fire before takeoff. No one had successfully landed a single-seat fighter behind enemy lines, loaded a second pilot into the cockpit, and flown home. But word of Priest's action also created a problem for military leadership, because what Priest had done was simultaneously heroic and insubordinate. Doolittle's dilemma. Lieutenant Priest had directly disobeyed a lawful order from his commanding officer in combat, twice. He had risked a valuable aircraft and his own life on an unauthorized rescue attempt. Every regulation and procedure said he should face court-martial. But he had also saved the life of one of the most promising squadron commanders in the European theater. Major Burt Marshall was an ace with 5 confirmed kills. He was a proven combat leader with aggressive tactics that inspired his men. His capture would have been a significant loss to the 355th Fighter Group and to the 8th Air Force as a whole. The question landed on the desk of Major General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force. The same man who had led the famous raid on Tokyo in 1942 now had to decide the fate of a young lieutenant who had done something simultaneously heroic and insubordinate. Doolittle had faced impossible decisions before. In April 1942, he had launched 16 B-25 bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier, knowing that none of them could return. Every plane had crash-landed or been abandoned when fuel ran out. 8 crewmen were captured by the Japanese. 3 were executed. Doolittle himself had expected court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor. Now, he confronted a mirror image of that situation. A young pilot had risked everything on an unauthorized mission and succeeded. Doolittle requested the full after-action reports from the 355th Fighter Group. He reviewed the radio transcripts, the witness statements from the escort pilots, and the maintenance logs documenting the condition of Priest's aircraft. The evidence was unambiguous. Lieutenant Priest had received a direct order from Major Marshall to abort the rescue attempt. He had acknowledged the order. Then he had ignored it and landed anyway. When Marshall repeated the order on the ground, Priest had ignored it again. The Uniform Code of Military Justice was clear. Disobeying a lawful order in combat was a court-martial offense. The punishment could range from reduction in rank to imprisonment. But Doolittle also understood something the regulations could not capture. The 8th Air Force was losing pilots faster than replacements could be trained. Every experienced aviator who survived another mission increased the odds for the men around him. Marshall was not just any pilot. He was a squadron commander, an ace, a tactical innovator whose aggressive style had influenced the entire fighter group. There was another consideration. The war was entering a critical phase. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. American pilots needed to believe that their comrades would not abandon them if they went down. Priest's rescue demonstrated something powerful. It showed that the bonds between pilots could transcend orders, regulations, and personal risk. Doolittle weighed these factors for 3 days. He consulted with his staff. He reviewed precedents for similar situations. There were none that matched exactly. The general made his decision. He would not court-martial Lieutenant Priest. Instead, he would recommend him for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. But Doolittle added a caveat. He was uncomfortable with the message that a Medal of Honor might send. If other pilots attempted similar rescues and failed, the cost would be measured in lives and aircraft. The 8th Air Force could not afford to encourage unauthorized heroics. Every pilot who landed behind enemy lines on a rescue attempt was gambling not just his own life, but the resources of his unit. Doolittle revised his recommendation. Instead of the Medal of Honor, he proposed the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation would praise Priest's courage and skill while implicitly acknowledging that his actions, however successful, should not become standard practice. The paperwork moved through channels. 8th Air Force Headquarters approved the recommendation and forwarded it to Washington. A ceremony was scheduled at Steeple Morden for late September. Lieutenant Priest would receive his medal from General Doolittle personally. The ceremony and legacy. The ceremony took place on September 21, 1944, at RAF Steeple Morden. Pilots from all 3 squadrons of the 355th Fighter Group assembled on the flight line. Ground crews paused their work to watch. The group commander stood beside General Doolittle as Lieutenant Priest marched forward to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Doolittle pinned the medal to Priest's chest. The blue ribbon with red and white stripes hung below the silver cross. It was the same decoration Doolittle himself had received for the Tokyo raid before being upgraded to the Medal of Honor. The general held Priest's hand for a moment after the pinning. He looked the young lieutenant in the eyes and delivered the message he had planned. He had never considered issuing a regulation prohibiting pilots from landing behind enemy lines to rescue comrades. The idea seemed so reckless, so fundamentally impossible, that no reasonable person would attempt it. Priest had proven that assumption wrong. What he had done was simultaneously the bravest and most foolish action Doolittle had witnessed in 2 years of commanding the 8th Air Force. The medal recognized the bravery. The decision to withhold the Medal of Honor acknowledged the foolishness. Priest accepted the decoration without protest. He had expected court-martial, not commendation. The Distinguished Service Cross was more than he had dared hope for. The rescue entered 8th Air Force legend as the first successful piggyback extraction in a P-51 Mustang. It would not be the last. Priest's example inspired other pilots to attempt similar rescues over the following months. On August 28, 10 days after Priest's flight, another 355th Fighter Group pilot landed in occupied France to rescue a downed comrade. His aircraft became stuck in mud. Both pilots evaded capture and eventually returned to Allied lines on foot. On October 3rd, 2 more rescue attempts occurred on the same day. One pilot successfully extracted his wingman in a single-seat fighter. The other became mired in soft ground. Both he and the pilot he tried to rescue were captured by German forces. The mathematics of the gamble were becoming clear. Some rescues succeeded. Others doubled the losses. The 20th Fighter Group recorded a successful piggyback rescue on November 18, 1944. First Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey landed his P-51 in a pasture and extracted his wingman under enemy fire. The 4th Fighter Group added another on March 18, 1945, when a pilot rescued Captain William McKinnon from occupied Germany. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had documented at least 5 successful single-seat fighter rescues. An unknown number of attempts had failed, resulting in additional casualties and lost aircraft. The tactic remained officially unauthorized. No regulation ever endorsed or prohibited it. Commanders simply looked the other way when pilots made the choice to risk everything for their comrades. After the war, Major Burt Marshall returned to combat duty within days of the rescue. His legs recovered fully from the circulation loss. He continued leading the 354th Fighter Squadron through the fall of 1944, adding to his victory count and earning a Silver Star for his leadership. By October, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and appointed deputy commander of the 355th Fighter Group. His final tally included 7 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, he continued his Air Force career, eventually commanding fighter wings in Japan during the occupation. His 3-time All-State quarterback record in Texas high school football was inducted into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in 1971. Colonel Royce Priest retired from the United States Air Force in 1968 after 28 years of service. His career had taken him from the wheat fields of France to the mountains of South America. He served 3 years as personal pilot to the President of Chile, where he met his wife, Anita. He trained fighter pilots for Allied nations. He flew jets that would have seemed like science fiction to the young lieutenant who landed a propeller-driven Mustang behind enemy lines. The Distinguished Service Cross remained his most prized possession. He rarely spoke about the rescue unless asked directly. When he did discuss it, he deflected praise toward the two escort pilots whose strafing runs had bought him time and toward the ground crews who rebuilt his damaged aircraft. He considered himself fortunate, not heroic. The two men remained friends for the rest of their lives. Their bond had been forged in a cockpit barely wide enough for one man, flying over enemy territory with a dying engine and no parachutes. That kind of experience does not fade with time. In December 2002, Colonel Priest wrote a letter to Bill Marshall, Bert's son. The letter contained the most detailed account of the rescue ever recorded. Priest described the hidden flak battery, the burning Mustang, the desperate landing, and the agonizing flight home. He wrote about the fear he had felt waiting to learn whether he would face court-martial. He wrote about the moment General Doolittle pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his chest. Most importantly, he wrote about why he had done it. Bert Marshall had been his hero long before the war. The chance to serve in his squadron had felt like destiny. When Marshall's aircraft caught fire over France, Priest had not calculated the odds or weighed the regulations. He had simply refused to let his hero die in a German prison camp. Colonel Royce Priest passed away on May 18, 2004, in Riverside, California. He was 81 years old. His obituary identified him as one of the few remaining World War II fighter aces and recipient of the nation's second highest award for valor. The P-51 Mustang that carried Priest and Marshall to safety was never preserved as a memorial. It served out the war, was likely sold as surplus, and disappeared into history like thousands of other warbirds. No museum displays a plaque commemorating the first piggyback rescue in 8th Air Force history. But the story survived. It passed from pilot to pilot, from veteran to historian, from father to son. Conclusion. On August 18, 1944, a 21-year-old lieutenant made an impossible decision. He disobeyed a direct order. He landed a fighter aircraft in enemy territory. He squeezed two men into a single-seat cockpit and flew them both home through 200 miles of occupied France. The regulations said what Priest did was wrong. The survival statistics said it was foolish. The mathematics of weight and distance said it was impossible. But sometimes the right thing to do and the smart thing to do are not the same thing. Sometimes courage means ignoring the voice in your head that lists all the reasons something can't be done and listening instead to the voice in your heart that says someone is worth saving. Priest and Marshall's story reminds us that the bonds of brotherhood can transcend orders and regulations, that some men are worth risking everything to save, that heroism is not always about destroying the enemy, but about refusing to abandon the men who fight beside you. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. These forgotten histories deserve to be remembered. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who risked everything for their comrades. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Royce Priest and Bert Marshall do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.